So here we are in wet woodland, and you can probably pick up the sound of running water. Everywhere I tread is pretty wet and sodden. There's lots and lots of little tributaries and streams everywhere, and generally you just get the impression that it's a wet woodland for a start. So here we are in a wet woodland, one of our fine scale habitats beneath a broadleaf woodland broad habitat. So this wet woodland has got quite a lot of running water going through it, lots of multiple streams and ditches, and the main tree species here is a mixture of, well, we've got quite a lot of sessile oak actually, but I know we've also got some willows and some alders as well. There's also a lot of sycamore, and there's some definitely hazel understory. So it's not always clear cut. There's some holly as well. On the ground flora here, right in front of me, we've got a lot of wood anemone and dog's mercury, and there's also bluebell areas, but it is very, very wet. And also we've got a few areas over to here of marsh marigold and some other wet species that I'll go into detail in a moment. So we're going to start with the species that are listed to be identified at the wildflower level. I haven't covered all of them, but hopefully a significant amount of them will be covered in this video. So this is one of the ones that we want to identify for wet woodland as well, which is bugle. Now, as you can see, it's not quite in flower yet, but you can see it's forming this very sort of almost orchid-like spike of flowers. And as you can see, very purple, and when the flowers do flower, they are very, very purple, and the leaves themselves have got a sort of tinged dark greeny purpley to them in places, and very shiny. So they're quite classically lobed with sort of no real stem as such, because it kind of forms just a sort of strap all the way down to the stem there, but very, very shiny dark green. So even when you don't have the flower spike, the shininess of them means that they're quite recognisable when they're out on the ground flora. So here's some bugle, more in flower than we saw it before. So if we look at this one in particular, you can see the little purple flowers coming out here at the bottom, and they'll all be all the way around, and you can see them on here as well. And a lot of people do think that they're orchids because of the way that they spike up like this, because there's quite a few here. But again, they're just a lovely, lovely woodland plant. You can see this one's a bit further along. Again, look how shiny those leaves are, and dark tinged as well, and obviously more dark at the top we go, with these lovely purpley blue hooded type corolla type flowers with this dark veining on them. So here we have the fabulous marsh marigold, which is one of our indicator species for wet woodland, and in fact it's one that you would need to record at both indicator and wildflower level. It's very distinctive. It's quite a large, robust plant. The leaves are almost like really big versions of lesser celandine, if you're familiar with that. Very much a sort of almost this sort of horseshoe shape, or heart-shaped really, with these very toothed edges, not really hairy, quite sort of fleshy. And then if we look at the flowers, you can see quite bright yellow, quite large, and very distinctive, with the five petals there, very sort of fleshy all over really. So here we have one of our indicator species, Pendulous Sedge. Now, I have this growing in my garden. It's pretty ubiquitous everywhere, but in some woodlands it can almost dominate the ground flora. Here it is just growing at the side of this woodland on the roadside. It's really wide leaves and actually quite sharp on the edge, so you do need to watch it, especially if you went back in the other direction. You probably could give yourself a bit of a paper cut. With these obvious ridges. It's a sedge, so it has the classic three-sided stems, and you can see this one's just about to flower. It's going to send up these on much longer stalks than they are now, and they're all going to droop or dangle like pendulums, hence the name Pendulous Sedge. And as you can see, the top one is going to be covered in yellow anthers and pollen. But you can see this often, it self-seeds everywhere, so you often find small little rosettes of it growing up. But again, it's quite yellowy green leaves and a very wide leafed sedge with very sharp, stiff edges. So if we look in amongst all of these leaves here, which can be a little bit daunting at first, we've got the one we saw from the dry deciduous woodland, which of course can grow in other woodlands as well, our dog's Mercury. We've got the yellow flowers of Lesser Celandine, which are just finishing now, they're one of the earliest ones. And we've got our leaves here of the wood anemone, again mostly finishing, we've still got the odd flower still about. But the other thing that we've got down here is these rather almost nothingy leaves again, in opposite pairs, alternating up the stem. These are only just coming out now, but this is Enchanter's Nightshade. And it will be very similar in a way to Dog's Mercury, with these sort of almost tiny little flowers on stalks that come up higher above the leaves. But at the moment, because we're having quite a late spring, it's not actually out yet. But I'll see if I can find some. Now, most of you will be familiar with cleavers, also known as sticky grass or goose grass. It's the stuff that you used to pick up and throw at your mates, and it would stick to their back and it would be a right laugh. As a result, it is incredibly sticky, but mainly because it's got lots of hooked hairs, which is why it sticks to some fabrics more than others, rather than actually anything gooey on the substance. It grows pretty much everywhere, it's ubiquitous. The presence of it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but it does tend to sort of grow with its mates here, nettles and things like that. The way to tell it apart from any of the other members of this family, which is known as the bedstraws, the Galiums, is the fact that it is so densely sort of sticky or hairy. It's very robust as well, and it has these very square stems as well. Here we have wood avens or herb bennet. Again, another densely hairy plant. Most people would know as perhaps one of the geums that they've planted in their garden, because it's very similar to that in its structure. And it has this sort of almost trifoliate or three-leaved leaflets appearance. Here I've managed to find a wood aven that's actually in flower. As you can see, it's really rather pretty. Very yellow with the 5 petals and the very obvious triangular pointed sepals that you can see poking out that are longer than all the petals here. And they're on relatively long flower stalks as well. So I've just come onto a bit of wet heath here to try and find some of our species that are missing from my list. Marsh Pennywort being one of them, and I just know that it grows here, so there might be some in the wet woodland behind me, but I thought I'd film it while I had the chance. So here we are. I found some of the Marsh Pennywort here, just creeping across the surface. As it does, it's very much a prostrate plant, it likes to creep across the surface of sphagnum here. They're like little circular-ish leaf shapes with very shallow toothed parts. Reminds me a little bit of navelwort, really. You can just see it creeping across the surface here. It does have flowers, but they're really not that often found and aren't really that distinctive, and probably better to go on the leaves, really. So here's one of the leaves a little bit more close up, and it has that quite obvious, almost dimpled centre there, with those very shallow teeth, and all you see is the little leaf poking up in through the other vegetation. Himalayan balsam, or sometimes referred to as Indian balsam, is a non-native invasive species, so down as a negative indicator. It's actually quite easy to identify in that it's really large. It's got very distinctive, big, showy, blousy pink flowers and really unique pods that sort of explode on contact. The stems are pretty much reddish, and the leaves have reddish sort of main stems, petioles to them as well, are quite sort of sharply toothed, and the leaves are sort of in whorls really around the stems, often found along waterways, riversides, etc., which is why it's included in the wet woodland.
and it can completely dominate where it seems to establish and do really, really well and completely take over.
So this can be something that perhaps might catch some of you out in the beginning days. This plant that's growing up straight from the ground here is actually honeysuckle, and you can see there's a little bit more here and over there. And one of the ways to tell that it's honeysuckle is firstly that the stems, even though it's such a short, small little plant, even now they're very woody and sort of stiff. And the leaves are very soft and densely hairy, especially when they're just as the sort of buds. And they almost give it a sort of greyish green appearance. And obviously you'll find that the older ones will be growing up around the trees because that's how they grow. They want to climb, they're climbers. But just to be warned that sometimes you can find it on the ground floor poking up, and this is one that our wildflower recorders want to notice as well. So here we have the honeysuckle doing its more usual behaviour. So it's climbing up here around a hazel, and it's winding its way all around these stems, and the new parts are very soft, but the existing stems are very, very woody, and obviously some of it will be old wood from last year, and then it's poking up stems coming out of it, and this is all honeysuckle. Another one of our indicator species for wet woodland, which actually also grows in dry deciduous, is this yellow pimpernel. So unfortunately it's still too early in the season and it's not flowering, but you can see it's just about to flower here. Again, they have quite shiny leaves, not as dark green as the bugle, but very shiny, so you can see them sort of creeping along the ground. Reddish stems towards the end here, and the leaves tend to be a little bit lighter at the end. You can see some more of it just growing across here, creeping along the ground. Different to creeping jenny, which is another one that you might actually see in wet woodland like this, because of the leaf shape mostly. So creeping jenny has the sort of very rounded leaves.
So here we have the most beautiful fern, in perhaps my opinion only, the royal fern. And as you can see, it actually isn't completely unfurled yet. It's just beginning its journey for this year. You can see it hasn't quite unfurled yet, but where it is starting to unfurl, you can see that the leaves, first of all, compared to other ferns at this time of year, they're quite yellow compared. The overall look of it is it takes up an enormous amount of space, and the dead leaves from last year, the dead fronds, are really thick, more like big brackeny stems here, but without the extra bits all along because they're more simple, but forming quite a large and substantial clump here. So one of the really interesting things about royal fern is that these green ferny fronds that everyone's more familiar with will be completely infertile. They won't have those funny little sporangi or sori on the back, and actually they have completely separate fronds that will come up in the centre, that will be the fertile fronds that look quite different, a sort of brown and clustered with all the fertile bits. The actual fronds themselves, they are twice pinnate, but the individual sort of pinnules are quite simple. They're not divided or toothed like some of our other ferns are. Here, where they've done just a little bit of woodland clearance here, you can see they've left the royal fern in all its glory, ready for this year. But can you just get the size of it? It really is a whopper of a fern.
So here we have the rather beautiful greater stitchwort in flower, as you can see. Beautiful, beautiful white flowers, all very much pointing up, coming off from multiple stems off the main stems here. You can see some more about to come out, and they're quite robust, and you can see that each petal is actually divided here almost in half, but not quite, Now lesser stitchwort, which is the one you get in the meadows rather than the woods, is so divided that it really does look like there are 2 petals there instead of 1. This is greater stitchwort. I just wanted to show you here greater stitchwort when not in flower. It's doing its very characteristic behaviour, which is where, because these sort of spiky leaves come off again opposite sides of the stem but alternating up, you can almost see that it forms a cross shape coming all the way up, and it's very distinctive in these mats, and it almost gets darker green as the season goes on as well. But this is greater stitchwort coming up here. Here we've got the rather lovely Marsh Valerian growing right in one of these very, very wet areas here. It's got umbellifer-like, because it is part of the carrot family, the Apiaceae, cluster of flowers that are very pink tinged when they're first coming open. As you can see, the buds are pretty pink. Oh, there's a little flower, as you can see here. And the leaves are very distinctive. As you can see, they've got this sort of long, large end lobe and then these smaller dividing leaflets below. And that's similar all the way up the stem. And this is Marsh Valerian, which is one of our indicator species for wet woodland. And you want to be able to identify this at wildflower level as well. Here's more Marsh Valerian. As you can see, the flower isn't quite as ahead on this one. You can see these very distinctive leaves here quite well.
I've only included one of the indicator level species for this particular habitat, remote sedge, which we'll cover next.
Here's another plant that you might find in the wet woodland. I mean, it grows in dry deciduous woodland as well, but it's quite classically along the edges of water sort of areas or wet areas. And this is a species called remote sedge, which is one that you need to be able to do at indicator level only. But when we get a bit closer to it, you can see all these tufts. Although it's a sedge, it is so fine-leaved that it looks a little bit more like a grass actually. But when you come up and you get further down, you can feel that it has the classic triangular cross-section, the 3-cornered sides, and it's very wiry and bristly. It's currently not in flower yet, but when it does, it has its flower heads very, very separate, which is why it's called remote sedge, because they're a little bit remote from each other. But I can't show you that at the moment because this one isn't in flower. A little patch of remote sedge looking very characteristic with these fine tufts, which you could also get with something like Dischampsia cespitota, tufted hairgrass. However, when you go up close to this one, you'll see that it's the very fine, narrow leaves of the sedge again with the triangular stems. But this is quite characteristic of how it would grow. So it's worth bearing in mind as an NPMS surveyor that not always will you just rely on the species on your species list in order to tell you what fine habitat you're in. Sometimes getting familiar with some of the other more sort of characteristic species that perhaps don't tell us as much about the health of the habitat but are more likely to appear in these distinctive habitat types can be quite useful. So for example, here we've got meadowsweet. Now again, it's one of these ones with the leaflets on either side, and the terminal leaflet, the end leaflet, as you can see, is divided into these 3 lobes. The stem is very brightly red, and it has these little miniature leaflet pairs as well. It's called meadowsweet because if you were to crush up a leaf and smell it, it smells sweet. And you often get it in wet meadows, on ditch sides, but you're also going to find it in probably wet woodland as well, like this one. So it's not one of our species that we need you to record at either indicator or wildflower level for wet woodland. However, it is worth noting that if it's here, it might suggest that some of the areas of the woodland are a bit wet. Now this is a species that you might find quite a lot of in the wet woodlands. I mean, even again in dry deciduous where maybe there's a stream running through. And it's very distinctive because it's carpets of this gorgeous, very lemony lime yellow on these little sort of succulent opposite leaves, and it's opposite-leaved golden saxifrage, and it's one of my favourites. But as you can see, it's growing right next to a little stream here. One of the other plants we've got coming here, which is also one of our indicators for this wet woodland habitat, is our wood speedwell, but this one's not in flower. but as again we saw in our earlier video, you can see the hairs go all the way around as well. Again, another species not on the wet woodland indicator list. However, again, you might likely to find it in a wood that's damper, dry deciduous or wet woodland, but it's also a lovely one, which is this, which is called Moshcatel, or town clock. The leaves are very similar to wood anemone, but they're much more rounded, the leaflet parts, as you can see. And if we come in to look at this little flower, it's got little flowers all the way round like clock faces. It's rather beautiful. So again, because this is wet woodland, this has several species of horsetail that come up, and I've just come across the fertile part of the horsetail. So normally you see the green sort of with whorled leaves coming up round, whereas this is the fertile stem that shoots up from the ground on its own like this.
The key to wet woodland as a habitat type is the sheer amount of water on the ground, whether there are streams, ponds, flooded areas or boggy areas, plus the tree species. Are there willows, alders, even downy birch as a dominant tree species, as well as some of the key species that we've covered here. I haven't managed to show you all the species on our indicator list for wet woodland, but hopefully this video has helped with at least the majority of them.